The thing that walked our hallway. There is a specific kind of silence that does not feel like silence at all. It feels like something holding its breath. I know that now. I have the language for it now, after years of turning it over and examining it from every angle, the way you keep examining a scar that healed wrong. But back when I was 12 years old and standing alone in a locked bathroom in our house in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus, Ohio, I had no words for what I was feeling. All I had was the cold weight of the door handle in my palm, the faint chemical smell of hand soap still drifting from the sink, and the absolute bone-deep certainty that I was not alone in that house. Let me start from the beginning. My family has never been the type to believe in anything we cannot explain through logic and observable evidence. My father spent 30 years as a structural engineer. My mother managed billing and compliance for a regional hospital network. My older brother Jake, who was 17 at the time of the events I'm about to describe, was the kind of teenager who read science news for fun and prided himself on being the most rational person in any given room. If you came to Jake with a ghost story, he would listen politely, tilt his head slightly to one side like a confused dog, and then methodically walk you through every possible rational explanation until you felt slightly embarrassed for having brought it up at all. Which is why, years later, when I finally sat him down at the kitchen counter and told him the full story of what happened that Tuesday afternoon, I watched his face go through skepticism and then something else entirely, a slow, reluctant, unmistakable recognition, before settling into a silence that told me everything I needed to know. But I am getting ahead of myself. It was a Tuesday in January, the worst possible variety of January in the Midwest, the kind where the sky turns the color of old dishwater by 9 in the morning and simply never changes for weeks on end. The ground was frozen. The trees were bare. The subdivision looked like a photograph taken by someone who had never seen color. I came home from school on the bus, dropped my backpack inside the front door, kicked my boots off onto the mat, and headed upstairs. My mom had called me while I was still on the bus to run through the afternoon logistics. Jake had left early to hang out at a friend's place across town. She and my dad were both working late and would be home around 7. There was leftover soup in the refrigerator. I would be alone until evening. That was fine. I was 12, not 6. I'd been home alone plenty of times. I went to my room, sat on my bed, plugged in my earbuds, and opened a video on my tablet. Normal. Unremarkable. The most ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the world. Here's the thing about being a quiet kid in an empty house, though. You develop habits. Irrational habits, you might say, though in the moment they feel absolutely essential. I never played music loud enough to fill the room. I never moved between rooms carelessly or announced my presence. When I was alone in that house, I moved through it like I was trying not to disturb something. My logic, such as it was, went like this. If someone had somehow gotten inside without me knowing, they could only find me if I made noise. Silence was camouflage. Silence was armor. I know how that sounds. I know it is the magical thinking of a nervous 12-year-old who had watched too many suspense movies. Except that day, the silence was not protecting me. That day, something else was using it. I paused my video and got up to use the bathroom. Now, the layout of our house matters enormously to this story, so I want to take a moment to walk you through it carefully. Our upstairs was arranged in an L shape. My bedroom sat at the base of the L. If you stepped out of my door and turned right, you walked down a short hallway past the bathroom and Jake's room at the far end, and then you reached the top of the staircase. The staircase was a split-level design. You descended half a flight to a small square landing platform in the middle, then continued down in the opposite direction to reach the ground floor. The front door was at the bottom. We had a home security system. Nothing elaborate, just a basic alarm panel near the front door, with a speaker that would announce, in a flat mechanical voice, which entrance had been used whenever a door or window was open. Front door open, back door open, side garage door open. We kept it active at all times, even during the day when we were home. It was just background noise, something we registered and filed away without thinking about. I was in the bathroom. The overhead light was on. The ventilation fan was running. Everything was ordinary. Then I heard the thud from Jake's room. It was a single heavy impact, like something had been dropped or something had fallen. Not shattering, not crashing, just a single blunt thud that seemed to absorb into the walls and leave a ringing silence behind it. My first thought was instantly rational. Jake must have come home early. His plans fell through, or he forgot something, or he just decided he'd rather be home. The thud was probably him dropping his bag on the floor the way he always did. I was reaching for the flush lever when my brain caught up with itself. Jake would have come through the front door. The alarm would have announced it. It always announced it. The sound was unmistakable, sharp and clear even from upstairs with the fan running. I had not heard it. I went still. The thud did not repeat. The house settled back into that loaded, weighted silence, the kind that is not quite silence, the kind that feels like a held breath, the kind I now have a name for. I stood completely motionless beside the toilet with my hands still on the lever, listening so hard my ears were beginning to create sounds on their own. I flushed, walked to the sink, turned on the water. All automatic, all slow, my body moving through the motions while some deeper part of me was doing something else entirely, calculating, assessing, arriving at conclusions my conscious mind was not yet ready to accept. Then I heard the voice. It was coming from Jake's room, low and continuous and just below the level of comprehension. The kind of muttering that you can tell is speech without being able to extract any actual words from it. There was the suggestion of consonants, an S here and a T there, the rhythm of language without the content. And the thing that sent a physical wave of cold down the back of my neck, was that it was not Jake's voice. Jake was 17 and had been finished growing for 2 years. This voice was adult in a different and heavier way, deeper, male, a voice that belonged to someone significantly older than my brother. Someone was in my brother's room. Someone who had not come through the front door. My stomach dropped with a physical force, like gravity doubling all at once. I did not have my phone. I had left it charging on my nightstand, which was 20 feet away down a hallway that now seemed impossibly exposed. The bathroom did have a cordless landline. My parents kept one in there, a habit from before everyone had cell phones. But it beeped 3 times loudly when you pressed the power button before you could dial anything. 3 loud beeps, audible from across the hallway. Audible from the room at the end of the hallway, where the voice was still muttering, low and continuous, to itself or to nothing. I pressed my back against the wall next to the bathroom door. I reached behind me and found the lock, a small push-button mechanism in the center of the handle, and turned it as carefully and quietly as I had ever done anything in my life. The tiny click it made sounded to me in that silence, like a gunshot. I held my breath. The muttering continued. That was when the footsteps started. They were slow and heavy and absolutely deliberate. Not the careless, natural movement of someone who thought they were alone, not the randomness of someone pacing or wandering. These footsteps had a direction and a purpose. I tracked them across Jake's room. I heard them reach the hallway. I heard the quality of the sound change as they moved from carpet to the hardwood of the corridor. They came toward me. They stopped directly outside the bathroom door. I have tried many times to describe what happened in my body in that moment. The closest I can get is this. Everything went very quiet inside me, the way a city goes quiet right before a major storm. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to press them flat against the wall just to give them something to do. I was calculating the window, second floor, concrete path below, 25 feet at least, unsurvivable, and I was calculating it anyway because some ancient animal part of me had already decided that unsurvivable was a relative term compared to whatever was on the other side of that door. Nothing happened. For what felt like several full minutes, nothing happened. The footsteps did not resume. The door handle did not move. There was no sound. Just that presence. That particular, loaded, impossible quality of stillness that comes from something choosing to wait rather than something being absent. Then the footsteps resumed. They moved toward the staircase. I tracked them step by step, down the first half of the staircase, heavier on the landing platform, down the second half, across the entryway floor. Then the front door opened. The alarm announced it in its flat mechanical voice. The front door closed. The alarm confirmed it. Relief should have come then. The rational explanation was right there, assembled and waiting. An intruder somehow inside, now outside, gone. It was over. The fear should have been draining away. Instead, I was running numbers. Our house had an old-fashioned laundry chute, a small hinged door built into the hallway wall at about knee height, maybe 12 inches square, leading directly down to the laundry room on the ground floor. It was a relic of the original construction, something my parents kept meaning to seal up and never got around to. The chute dropped straight down from the upstairs hallway to the laundry room, but the laundry room was at the opposite end of the ground floor from the front door. To reach the laundry room from the front door by any normal route, walking through the entryway, through the living room, through the kitchen, took at minimum 30 seconds. The front door had closed fewer than 10 seconds ago. The pounding on the laundry chute door hit like 3 gunshots in rapid succession. Hard, violent, precise. Like someone had thrust a blunt object upward through the narrow chute from below and was driving it against the small hinged door with everything they had. The door vibrated in its frame. The sound filled the hallway, confined, reverberant, impossibly close. I was standing 4 feet away from it, still pressed against the bathroom wall, and I watched the chute door shudder with each impact, watched the old hinges strain, and I pressed both hands over my mouth and pressed my back harder into the tile and waited for it to break open. 3 impacts, then silence, then nothing. I stayed in that bathroom for a long time, long enough for the thin winter light outside the window to shift its angle noticeably, long enough to talk myself into going out there and then talk myself back out of it 3 separate times, long enough to replay every second of what I had heard until I could recite it in order. The thud, the silence, the voice, the footsteps, the pause at the door, the descent, the front door, the impossible timing, the chute. When I finally made myself leave, I moved like the hallway floor might give way beneath me. I went directly to my room, wedged my desk chair under the door handle, sat on my bed with my phone in both hands, and tried to call my mother. Voicemail. My father. Voicemail. I sent Jake a text that said, "Only come home, please," and then sat counting the seconds on the clock until the front door alarm announced my parents' arrival just after 7. They did not believe me. My mother said the house made strange sounds and that I had startled myself. My father said old houses were full of inexplicable noises and that I was working myself up. Jake came home an hour later and listened to my account with the patient, slightly condescending tolerance of someone who has already decided on his conclusion and is only waiting for you to finish talking so he can provide it. I stopped trying to convince them. I let it go. I moved on in the way that 12-year-olds move on, by burying it under enough ordinary life that it starts to feel, most of the time, like something you might have dreamed. It was not until 4 years later, college home for the holidays, Jake and I both in the kitchen late on a warm summer night, that I brought it up again. I told him the full story, in sequence, without editorializing. I watched his face go through several expressions I had not expected, the dismissiveness I'd anticipated, and then something else, moving beneath it. And then, a long, careful quiet. Then he told me about the attic access. Our house had an attic panel in the ceiling of Jake's bedroom, a square of drywall on hinges that you could push open with a broom handle to access the space above. For 2 full years following that January, Jake had heard sounds coming from that panel. Not the sounds a house makes when it settles. He knew those sounds, had cataloged them, had a rational explanation for each one. These were different, directional, deliberate. The sounds, he said, of something that knew where the panel was and wanted him to know it knew. He had never told our parents. He had never told me. We sat with that information for a while in the quiet kitchen. We have not figured it out. We have not stopped trying. And Jake, the most determinedly rational person I have ever known, has not, in the years since that conversation, once suggested that either of us imagined anything. The man in the hallway. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story, because it will change how you hear everything that follows. I am not a paranoid person. I was not a paranoid teenager. I grew up in the Bronx. I started navigating the subway alone at 14 and became fluent in its logic, the way the car fills at certain stops, the specific body language that means someone is sleeping versus someone is watching, the geometry of which end of which platform puts you closest to the exit at your destination. I learned before I was old enough to drive that the world contains a wide spectrum of threatening energy, and that the most important skill in the world is learning to tell the difference between something that is genuinely wrong and something that merely reads as unfamiliar. I was not the kind of girl who catastrophized. I was not jumpy. I was not easily frightened by things that could not hurt me. When I tell you that my neighbor terrified me from the very first week we moved in, I need you to understand that this was not anxiety or overreaction or the hypervigilance of someone who had not yet learned to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. It was the opposite. It was the finely calibrated threat assessment of a young woman who had spent her entire life reading rooms correctly, and who was reading this one with perfect accuracy. I was 16. My mom and I had moved into a building in the Bronx 6 months earlier, 7th floor, second to last apartment in the North Corridor. Pre-war construction, which meant the walls were thick and the ceilings were high, and the radiators knocked through the winter nights with a rhythm you eventually stopped noticing. The apartment was small but functional. My room had a window that faced east and caught the early light. We had made it work. The man at the end of the hall was there the first day we moved in. He was in his 60s, black, with the remnants of gray hair cut very close to his head. He sat outside his apartment in a wooden chair, positioned just in front of his door, or sometimes on the narrow windowsill at the corridor's dead end, where a small casement window looked out over the fire escape. He was there when I left for school at 7 in the morning. He was there when I came home in the afternoon. He was there late at night when I went to get something from the vending machine by the elevators. He was always there, always in one of those two positions, always with the same expression, which was no expression at all. A face like still water, watching. He never looked at my mother. He looked at me, not the brief acknowledgement of a neighbor who recognizes you from the corridor. A sustained, deliberate, tracking look that followed me from the moment I stepped off the elevator to the moment our apartment door closed behind me. Every single time. Without fail. My mother noticed within the first 2 weeks and told me, in the same casual tone she used for everything, to keep my distance, not to engage, to look at my phone when I walked past him. She said it like a practical instruction rather than a warning. But I saw the expression she wore while giving it. We assumed at first that he was simply an odd old man with nowhere to be and nothing to do. Buildings in the Bronx have their share of eccentric residents. We told ourselves that. We believed it mostly for about 3 weeks. Then he called me by my name. I was coming off the elevator on a Thursday afternoon, backpack on, earbuds in, walking toward our apartment. He was on the windowsill at the corridor's end. I was passing his door when he said it, just my name, Elissa, in a flat, affectless tone. And I stopped walking so abruptly it was like hitting a wall. I turned. He was looking at me with that same expressionless face. He said, "Have a good day," and looked away, as if this were completely normal, as if he had simply been greeting a neighbor he had met through ordinary means. I kept walking. I went inside and locked both locks and stood in the entryway for a moment with my back against the door, running through every possible explanation for how he could know my name. Our building mailbox listed only our unit number. We had not been introduced to any neighbors. We had no mutual acquaintances in the building that I was aware of. We had not told anyone our names except the building management office. He just knew. After that, it became routine. Every time he saw me alone in the corridor, never when my mother was with me, always when I was alone, he would say my name. Sometimes paired with an observation about the weather. Sometimes with a comment about what I was wearing. Always in that flat, unreadable tone, with those eyes that followed me without ever quite changing expression. I started timing my trips through the corridor. I would wait in the elevator for an extra minute before pressing my floor, hoping he might have gone inside. I started texting my mom on my way up so she could have the door open when I arrived, minimizing my exposure to 30 seconds of corridor. I developed a rapid, eyes-forward walk that made it clear I was not stopping and was not interested in engagement. He greeted me by name every single time anyway. Looking back, I understand now that this was deliberate. The use of my name was not friendliness. It was demonstration. It was him showing me, repeatedly and specifically, that he had access to information about me that I had not chosen to share. It was a power move dressed up as a pleasantry. At 16, I did not have that precise framework for it, but I felt it. My body understood it even when my vocabulary was still catching up. Then came the Thursday night in October. My mother had recently taken a second job working nights at a medical facility to cover some expenses we do not need to go into. She left for her shift around 8:30 in the evening and would be home by 6 the following morning. I was 16 and capable of being alone overnight. I had done it before. I had a phone. I knew the building's super's number and 3 of our neighbors' numbers. It was fine. I came home at 9, later than usual because I had stayed after school to work on a project. The corridor was lit by its usual fluorescent light, that flat institutional glow that made everything look slightly faded. He was on the windowsill. I had my keys already in hand. I was moving at my practiced pace, looking at my phone. I was 15 feet from our apartment door when he spoke. "Your mom working the night shift tonight?" I stopped. Every instinct I had gone off at once, a circuit board overloading. Not just the wrongness of him knowing my name, I had been living with that for months, but the wrongness of him knowing my mother's schedule, of him knowing she worked nights, of him knowing specifically that she was gone that night. I nodded. I do not know why. It was automatic, the social reflex kicking in before my judgment could override it, and I immediately felt the mistake register somewhere below conscious thought. I turned away, covered the remaining distance to our door in 3 fast steps, got inside, shut the door, and threw both the deadbolt and the chain. I stood with my back against the door and breathed. Then I told myself I was being paranoid. I made myself go through the normal motions of the evening, washed my face, had dinner, did homework at the kitchen table. I took the laundry down to the basement machines and brought it back up without incident. By the time I got into the shower around 11, I had almost convinced myself that I had overreacted, that he was just a strange old man who paid too close attention to building routines. That I was fine. In the shower, I heard a sound through the wall, low and directional, not the groaning of pipes under pressure, which I knew well, but something else, organic and purposeful. It seemed to come from the wall that our bathroom shared with the adjacent unit, and it did not repeat. I rinsed off and got out of the shower. I got dressed in the bathroom, which was a habit I had developed months ago without quite understanding why. Then I went to my bedroom to locate the source of the sound. I searched the room visually first, nothing obvious. Then I walked the perimeter, running my fingers along the walls, looking for anything unusual. I was almost convinced it had been the pipes after all when I found it near the corner where the bedroom wall met the bathroom wall. Small, precise, perfectly circular. Clearly not a natural imperfection in the drywall. A hole, smaller than a dime. Drilled, not worn. The edges were clean and deliberate. I did not touch it. I bent down slowly and looked through it. My brain had already run the calculation before I put my eye to the hole. It had already added up every data point, the name, the schedule, the directional sound, the location of the hole, and arrived at the only conclusion that made coherent sense of all of them together. I knew what I was going to see. An eye was looking back at me through the hole. I fell backward into the dresser behind me, hard enough to bruise my hip. I sat on the floor with my back against the dresser and my hands pressed flat on the carpet, and I breathed, because breathing was the only thing I could think to do. Then I got up and went back to the bathroom. I ran my hands across every inch of the shower wall, tile by tile, corner to corner, working slowly and methodically, looking for the companion to what I had found in the bedroom. I found it at approximately chest height on the wall that shared a surface with his apartment. Another small, precise, deliberately drilled hole, positioned at exactly the right angle and height to give a clear line of sight into the shower. He had drilled holes through the shared wall. He had been watching me, in my bedroom, in the shower. For an unknown length of time, weeks, possibly months, possibly since before we moved in, he had been watching me. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, voice tired but present, and I told her in the calmest voice I could manage. I was still talking when the knock came at the front door. 3 hard, deliberate impacts. Then his voice, completely flat, as if he were simply correcting a misunderstanding. "Open the door. Open the door right now." I didn't drill those holes. He knew I'd found them. He had been watching through one when I discovered the other. "Call 911, my mother said. She was already moving, I could hear it. "Right now, I'm coming home." The police arrived in under 5 minutes. The Bronx has fast response times in residential buildings, especially with a calm, coherent caller who can provide a precise address and a specific description of what is happening. There were 2 officers at our apartment door while he was still in the corridor. He did not attempt to leave. He stood against the opposite wall with his arms crossed and told them with perfect composure that it was a misunderstanding, that the holes had always been there, that the girl had a history of imagining things. My mother arrived 30 minutes later. She pressed charges for stalking, criminal trespass, and invasion of privacy. The building management served him an eviction notice within 72 hours and patched both holes at his expense before the week was out. He was convicted. I still check walls. Not every time, not in every room, but in new spaces, in spaces where I feel an inexplicable wrongness, I check. I notice the diameter of holes. I pay attention to which direction sound travels and what might lie on the other side of a shared surface. Most people who know me now would describe this as a particular attentiveness to my physical environment. I know where it came from. I know exactly where it came from. And I know that the instincts that told me something was wrong from the very beginning were never paranoia. They were right every single time. Something that walks on 2 legs. I want to start with something that might seem small but will matter enormously by the end. My friend Hal is the best prepared person I have ever met in my life. Not in a performance anxiety, overcompensating way. It is simply his baseline. He has been an Eagle Scout since he was 15. He can read a topographic map the way most people read a restaurant menu. He knows, off the top of his head, which plants in the Pacific Northwest are edible, how to treat a snakebite in the field, how to navigate by Polaris when you have no compass, how to build a shelter from materials available in a Douglas fir forest in under an hour. He has spent more nights outdoors than indoors in the past decade. He is calm in emergencies. He does not panic. He assesses. When Hal says he has never heard anything like that in his life, and he still has no idea what it was, I believe him with a completeness that I do not extend to almost any other statement anyone has ever made to me, because Hal does not say things like that. Hal has an explanation for things. Hal's entire relationship with the wilderness is built on the premise that the natural world is comprehensible if you study it carefully enough. Whatever was in those woods that night was not something he had studied, not something anyone had studied, as far as we have been able to determine. But I am getting ahead of myself. I am not an outdoors person. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, where the wilderness is present at the edge of everything. You can see the mountains from downtown on a clear day. You can smell the forest when the wind comes in from the east. But I had always interacted with it from a comfortable remove. I hiked the same 3 accessible trails near the city. I car camped once in college and considered that a sufficient education. When Hal invited me on one of his backcountry trips, I said yes because I did not want to be the kind of person who would say no. Because Hal made it sound uncomplicated. Because his girlfriend at the time, Maya, was also coming and also did not have significant wilderness experience, and there was safety in numbers. We drove out on a Friday afternoon in September, when the light still lasted late, and the temperatures at elevation were cold enough to make a fire feel necessary rather than merely pleasant. 3 hours south and east of Portland, along a state highway that progressively shed its infrastructure, the towns getting smaller, the commercial signage disappearing, the road narrowing until the painted center line simply ended and was not replaced. Hal turned off the paved road onto a gravel track, drove until the gravel ended, and continued onto a dirt path that wound between the trees until it was no longer clearly distinguishable from the forest floor. He put the truck in park, turned off the engine. "This is it," he said. I looked out the window at dense, undifferentiated forest. No clearing, no marker, no indication that this particular spot had been chosen for any reason over any of the thousands of identical spots we had driven past for the last 20 minutes. "Where's the campsite?" Maya asked from the passenger seat. "You're looking at it," Hal said. He was already getting out of the truck. This is Hal's wilderness philosophy. Developed campsites with their numbered plots and communal fire rings and neighboring families with portable speakers represent a simulation of the outdoors rather than the thing itself. Real camping means going somewhere without infrastructure, without other people, without the accumulated noise of human convenience. He had been doing this his entire adult life, and had always come home. I have since revised my opinion on this philosophy. I've revised it quite substantially. We unloaded the truck. 2 tents in separate stuff sacks, sleeping bags, a cooler of food, cooking equipment, a camp stove, a first aid kit, a folding table, lanterns, rope. Hal said this was a light trip because he was accommodating Maya and me. I chose not to think too carefully about what a heavy trip looked like. He assigned tasks efficiently. I knew how to pitch a tent, so I handled both tents while Maya helped by holding poles and handing me stakes and providing running commentary on the process that was more entertaining than practically useful. Hal disappeared into the trees to gather firewood, returning every 20 minutes or so with an armload of dry wood. He had a specific system for identifying what burned well and what didn't. Something about the sound when you knocked 2 pieces together. Night came faster than I had anticipated. The tree canopies swallowed the last of the light well before the sky above went fully dark, and the temperature dropped with it. A sharp, definitive drop that made the fire Hal had built feel less like a luxury and more like a necessity. We ate around it, then sat with drinks as the evening settled in. Maya, Hal, and I talked about people we knew, things that had happened in school, the particular kind of nostalgic rambling that a fire and darkness and a slight alcohol haze invite. It was pleasant. It was, for a few hours, genuinely perfect. Maya went to her tent sometime around 11. She was tired and had less tolerance for the cold than Hal and I did, and she had been working long hours all week. We said goodnight, and Hal and I stayed by the fire, talking more quietly now, keeping the laughter down out of courtesy. I was on my last drink. The fire had dropped from its earlier height to a sustained, even burn, less dramatic but steady, throwing a wide circle of amber light into the surrounding dark. Beyond its reach, the forest was absolute. No moon yet, stars visible in the narrow strip of sky between the treetops, but no ambient light from any human source. I had not understood until that moment how completely and specifically dark a forest at night could be, how the darkness in a forest is different from the darkness of a city with its power cut, how it has a texture and a depth that urban darkness simply does not possess. Hal said, "Shh." I stopped mid-sentence. He had gone very still, head slightly tilted, facing the dark beyond the fire's reach. His drink was set down on the ground beside his chair, with a care that suggested he had not decided to set it down, but rather that his hands had done it automatically while his attention went elsewhere. I heard it then. Footsteps. Coming from the forest beyond the firelight, somewhere in the trees to the north of our camp, moving parallel to us, not approaching directly, but orbiting. The sound was heavy and measured and immediately, obviously bipedal. Not the rapid, scattered movement of a small animal. Not the 4-beat cadence of anything on 4 legs. 2 feet. Deliberate. Unhurried. Deer, Hal said. His voice was even, but I had been watching him and his eyes had not moved from the darkness. Deer don't walk like that, I said. He did not answer. The footsteps continued their arc. Slightly closer now with each pass, not a linear approach but a spiral, the radius decreasing incrementally in a way that might have been coincidence if it happened once. It didn't happen once. It happened 5 times, 6 times, each circuit ending slightly nearer than the last. And by the 4th circuit, I had stopped pretending to have a conversation and was simply sitting forward in my chair, staring into the dark at the edge of the firelight, watching for movement. Then the sound changed. Underneath the footsteps, or maybe between them, a new element entered. A clicking, irregular rhythm that I had no reference point for. Not a sound any animal I knew made. Not a sound any person makes. It had an organic quality. It seemed to come from a throat, from something that breathed. But it was also mechanical in its regularity, like a biological process running at the wrong speed, like something mimicking a sound it had heard without fully understanding what produced it. It built slowly from beneath the threshold of easy hearing to something that was impossible to ignore. Rhythmic, persistent, wrong in every frequency. Hal. He stood up from his chair, in one motion, smooth and quiet. He did not speak. He made a single gesture, a quick tilt of his head toward the tents, unmistakable, and then he was moving toward Maya's tent. I went to mine. I unzipped the door with as little sound as I could manage, and got inside and zipped it closed behind me. And then lay completely still on my sleeping bag, with my arms at my sides and my eyes wide open, watching the tent wall glow with the light of the dying fire. The clicking grew louder. The footsteps were no longer circling. They were approaching, directly, purposefully, without the pretense of the earlier orbital pattern. I tracked them across the camp, not toward my tent but toward Hal and Maya's, which was pitched 10 feet to my north. The footsteps were slower than I would have expected for something so close. Slower and heavier. And each impact with the ground seemed to require more force than the distance between steps should have produced, as if whatever was walking weighed significantly more than its gait would suggest. The footsteps stopped. I watched the wall of my tent in the dying firelight, no shadow visible from my angle, just the fabric vibrating faintly in the cold air, the faint creak of the tent poles settling. Then Maya screamed. Not a nightmare scream, not the startled vocalization of someone who woke suddenly. The full register scream of someone confronting the immediate physical threat. The tent wall beside her, she told us later, had been pushed inward. Not the give of wind or animal pressure, but a sustained, intentional push. Something applying weight from outside, pressing through the fabric at a height of about 5 feet, as if testing the material's resistance. Hal was outside before she finished the first scream. I heard him yell her name, then heard both of them scrambling out of the tent, then heard his voice cut through the dark. Run. Run now. Go. I was outside before I had made any decision to be outside. The cold hit me like a wall. The fire was nearly dead, just embers now, and the camp was almost completely dark. I could make out Hal's shape and Maya's shape ahead of me, and I ran toward them. And then we were all 3 running, none of us with flashlights, none of us with phones in hand, running in total darkness through a forest we had arrived at in daylight and had no mental map of. Something was behind me. I did not turn to look. You make that decision in the first fraction of a second, and once made, you do not revisit it, because looking backward costs you the ground you are gaining, and the thing behind you does not need you to cooperate. I kept running. The footsteps behind me were slower than mine. I was moving in a panicked sprint, covering ground as fast as my legs would carry me. But they were heavier, and they were consistent, and they did not seem to be tiring. They maintain their distance with a patience that, in retrospect, is the most disturbing single element of the entire night. Hal found the truck. I still do not understand how. He did it in complete darkness with no landmarks and no path. He will say that he had unconsciously mapped the camp when we set up, that he had a sense of the truck's bearing relative to the camp that he was drawing on. I believe him because Hal does not fabricate explanations to make himself sound capable. But I also know that finding a specific vehicle in the dark in a dense forest while running from something is the kind of navigation that belongs in a category separate from ordinary skill. The truck was there. We got in. Hal had the engine running before I had both feet inside. He drove. About 40 seconds down the dirt track, the headlights swept a wall of trees. Dead end. Hal had driven in on the only track and it did not loop. It terminated. He would have to turn the truck around. He stopped. I watched his face in the dashboard light, jaw set, processing. Then he began moving the truck through a 3-point turn, drive to reverse to drive, in a space barely wider than the truck's wheelbase, with trees on both sides that the headlights could barely separate from the darkness. "Turn the lights off," I said. "I need to see the trees." "Turn them off so it can't see where we are. I'll hit something. Drive, reverse, drive. Give me a minute." I pressed myself into the corner of the back seat and rotated between all 4 windows, watching the tree line in the headlight wash, looking for movement, looking for the shape I'd seen suggested on my tent wall. The vast, bipedal, wrong-proportioned shadow that had passed in the firelight during the minutes before. Everything accelerated. Nothing visible. Nothing yet. Hal got the truck turned around. He drove until we hit the state highway. He drove for 15 minutes on the highway before anyone said anything. We left everything at the campsite. Both tents, sleeping bags, the cooler, the cooking equipment, all of it. Somewhere between $150 and $200 of gear, abandoned in a dark forest in southern Oregon. None of us discussed going back. The conversation, if it could be called that, lasted about 4 seconds and consisted entirely of Hal saying, "We're not going back," and Maya and me saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. What was it? We have spent years with that question. Here is everything we know with certainty. It walked on 2 legs, with a cadence consistent with upright bipedal movement and inconsistent with any animal that moves on 2 legs that we have been able to identify, including, Hal specifically notes, humans. The footfalls were too heavy for a person of any size he could estimate from the sound alone. The sound it made, the clicking, rhythmic vocalization, doesn't match any known North American animal, call that we have found in any reference, including specialized audio archives of wildlife sounds that Hal tracked down specifically to compare. The size, as estimated by the height at which it pushed against Maya's tent wall, suggests something approaching 7 feet in standing height. And it circled the camp for what we estimate was 30 minutes before approaching, which suggests either a level of patience inconsistent with predatory animal behavior or a level of deliberation inconsistent with any animal behavior we are aware of. We have considered every rational framework we can construct. We have considered a bear, a large human, an animal we have simply never encountered, a shared hallucination enabled by alcohol and darkness and the power of suggestion. We have considered each of these seriously and set each of them aside for specific reasons that I will not enumerate here because this account is already long and because the reasoning is available to anyone who wants to think it through carefully. We keep arriving at the same place. We do not know what it was. What I know is this: whatever was in that forest made a choice. It circled us for half an hour. It approached. It pushed against the tent. It followed us when we ran. And then it let us go. I've spent considerable time since that night being grateful for that last part, and trying not to think too hard about what it means that letting us go appears to have been a decision it made, rather than an outcome we determined. Hal still camps. He goes alone sometimes. He does not go back to Southern Oregon. I go to campsites now, the kind with numbered plots and communal fire rings, and neighboring families with portable speakers. I do not think this makes me less adventurous than Hal. I think it makes me someone who has thought very carefully about what we encountered and made a reasonable decision about acceptable risk based on available evidence. Every one of these stories is real. Every person who lived through them carries it with them still, not as a fading memory that softens with time, but as a permanent calibration in how they move through the world. They check walls. They listen to the sounds a house makes before they relax in it. They think, when they are in the woods at night and away from the light, about what else might be out there, unhurried in the dark, deciding whether to approach. The first storyteller is now an adult with children of their own, living in a house they chose specifically for its simple, linear floor plan. The laundry chute in their parents' house was sealed the following spring. No one in the family talked about why. Alyssa moved out of that building 6 months after the arrest, once the lease permitted. She lives in a newer construction now, where the walls are thin enough that shared sound is always identifiable and explicable. She keeps the lights on in hallways. She never answers questions about her schedule from people she does not trust. Maya does not camp anymore, and has not since that September. Hal still goes into the backcountry, still reads topographic maps, still identifies firewood by the sound of 2 pieces knocked together. He is still the most prepared person in any room he enters. He has never been able to explain what he heard in that forest. He says this without distress and without drama, in the calm, factual tone of someone who has simply cataloged something and filed it accurately under. No explanation available. If you have a story like these, something that happened to you, something you have never been able to explain to your own satisfaction, something that changed the way you understand the dark, you do not have to keep carrying it alone. Some of us are listening, and some of us will believe you.